He had always known this moment would come, yet knowing did nothing to prepare him for the sheer weight of it. The morning light, pale and thin, filtered through the heavy curtains of the London townhouse, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. Charles stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the rain begin to streak the glass. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Behind him, two women, two halves of his fractured heart, and sat in a silence so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own. Kate was perched on the edge of the settee, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white. She wore a simple cream dress, a stark contrast to the opulent darkness of the room. Her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were fixed on a point on the floor, lost in a sea of uncertainty. She was not yet a duchess, not yet a fully fledged member of this gilded cage. She was simply a woman in love, facing a reality she could never have anticipated. On the opposite chair, Camilla sat with an almost regal stillness. She was older, wiser in the ways of this world, and her face was an unreadable mask. Decades of navigating the treacherous currents of royal life and public scorn had honed her composure to a razor's edge. She watched Kate, not with malice, but with a complex mixture of pity, jealousy, and a strange, possessive protectiveness over the man who stood silhouetted against the rain. And this was not a confrontation of rivals, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more painful, an acknowledgement of a legacy of pain. Charles finally turned, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He looked from one woman to the other, his face etched with a lifetime of longing and indecision. He was the Prince of Wales, the future king, yet in this room he was simply a man, stripped of his titles, drowning in the consequences of his own heart. He moved slowly, deliberately, and lowered himself onto the settee beside Kate. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The act of sitting next to her, of choosing her physical proximity, was a statement in itself. His hand reached out, not with the confident, practiced grip of a royal, but with the trembling hesitation of a boy. His fingers found hers, cold and still, and he wrapped them in his own, a silent, desperate plea for understanding, for forgiveness, for strength. He gripped Kate's hand, and in that grip was the weight of his past, the uncertainty of his future, and the fragile hope of his present. It was a quiet desperation, a wordless communication that said, "Stay. Please, stay. I need you." He wasn't just holding her hand. He was anchoring himself to her, to the new beginning she represented. For a fleeting moment, Kate felt the warmth of his skin, the pressure of his fingers. It was a lifeline, a confirmation amidst the storm. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. In them, but she saw not the prince, but the man she loved, vulnerable, conflicted, and terrified. Her heart ached for him, even as her own was heavy with the indignity of the situation. She gave his hand the slightest squeeze in return, a tiny flicker of solidarity in the glacial room. Then a voice, quiet but with the sharp clarity of a bell, cut through the silence. "Charles," Camilla said, her tone not unkind but firm, brooking no argument. "Let her go." It wasn't a request. It was a command. But the words hung in the air, a stark intrusion into their private moment. Camilla rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked towards them, the soft rustle of her silk dress the only sound. She stopped before them, looking down at their clasped hands as if they were a wound that needed tending. "Charles," she repeated, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. "You are hurting her. Release it." The command was for him, but her eyes, for the briefest of moments, and flickered to Kate. And in that look, Kate saw something that surprised her. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't cruelty. It was a weary kind of recognition. Camilla understood what Kate was feeling, perhaps better than anyone. She had been the other woman for decades, her life a relentless storm of public vilification. She knew the price of loving this man. And in that moment, she was demanding that he stop clinging to Kate as a life raft, stop dragging her further into the wreckage of his past. Camilla was not demanding Kate be released from his love, but from the public spectacle of his desperation. She was forcing him to be strong, not for her, but for the young woman beside him. It was a bizarre, twisted act of protection. Charles's grip tightened for a second, a final stubborn rebellion against the hard truth. Then his fingers loosened. He let Kate's hand go, letting it fall gently back into her lap. The separation felt physical, a severing of a vital cord. Not Kate felt the sudden chill on her skin where his hand had been, a cold that seeped into her bones. She looked up at Camilla, her expression a mixture of gratitude and resentment, a confusing swirl of emotions she couldn't yet untangle. The first act of this deeply human drama was over, but the play was just beginning. The release of his hand was not a release from his love, but a release into a new, more painful phase of their shared ordeal. In the days that followed, a strange but unspoken dynamic settled over the three of them. There were no more secret meetings, no more stolen moments. Instead, there was a constant, invisible chaperone in the form of the past. Every look Charles gave Kate, every gentle word, seemed to be measured against a ghost. Kate found herself living in a house of mirrors, where every reflection showed her not just herself, but a distorted image of the woman who came before. She would catch Camilla's perfume in the hallway, a lingering scent that was a reminder of her permanence. The staff, impeccably trained, would sometimes slip, addressing a query to Mrs. Parker Bowles before catching themselves. The very walls seemed to whisper of a decades-long history she was not a part of. She tried to discuss it with Charles, to voice the creeping insecurity that was beginning to take root. They would walk in the palace gardens, a royal paradise of manicured lawns and vibrant flower beds. Yet to Kate, they felt like a gilded cage. "She's everywhere, Charles," she said one afternoon, her voice tight. They had stopped by a small, ornate pond, the water still and reflective. "It's like trying to build a life on ground that's already been claimed." Charles looked haggard, the weight of his dual existence pressing down on him. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I know, my darling, I know, but it's not as simple as just erasing the past. I can't. She was my solace for so long. My life with her was a secret, but it was my truth." His words, meant to be an explanation, were a knife to Kate's heart. She was my truth. What did that make her then? A convenient lie? A public relations solution? The insecurities, once a whisper, now became a roar. She began to scrutinize every interaction. A lingering glance from Charles across a crowded room was no longer just a glance. It was a comparison. A thoughtful gift was no longer just a gift. It was a gesture learned from a lifetime of pleasing another woman. Meanwhile, Camilla's presence, though often physical, was more potently spectral. She was navigating her own complex transition, from secret lover to an acknowledged yet undefined figure on the periphery. She was no longer just the other woman. She was being asked to become a friend, a confidant, to the woman who had taken her place. It was an almost impossible ask. She began to make small, almost imperceptible gestures. Yes, she would send Kate a book she thought she might like, with a simple, unsigned note. She ensured that Charles's favorite flowers were placed in Kate's sitting room, a subtle hint that she knew his preferences, a way of offering her knowledge as a gift, not a weapon. She was trying to build a bridge, but every plank she laid was infused with the bittersweet timber of her own lost love. Kate, in her isolation, began to see Camilla not as a monolithic obstacle, but as a fellow traveler on a bizarre and painful journey. One evening, at a small private gathering, Kate watched Camilla from across the room. She saw the way Camilla's eyes would follow Charles, a habitual, almost unconscious act of devotion. She saw the easy, unspoken communication between them, a shorthand built over decades. It wasn't just about love. It was about shared history, shared jokes, shared grief. And for the first time, Kate felt not jealousy, but a profound sense of inadequacy. How could she ever compete with that? How could she ever build a history that could rival a lifetime? The pressure cooker of royal life was not designed for three. It was a world of rigid protocol, of one rightful place, one consort. The simmering tensions finally boiled over on a rainy autumn afternoon. Kate, Charles, and Camilla found themselves alone in the library of a country estate, a fire crackling in the hearth, attempting a fragile, an awkward coexistence. The conversation had been stilted, veering from safe topics like the weather and estate business into dangerous, emotional silences. It was Kate who finally broke. The weeks of silent comparison, of feeling like a ghost in her own love story, culminated in a single, raw question. She looked directly at Camilla, her voice trembling but clear. "How do I do this?" she asked. "How do I love him when the world, and he himself, will always measure me against you? How do I find my place when his heart has a room with your name permanently on the door?" The question hung in the air, heavy and honest. Charles froze, his gaze darting between them. Camilla, for the first time, let her mask slip. The practiced composure dissolved, revealing a landscape of old pain, regret, and a deep, abiding weariness. She looked at Kate, really looked at her, seeing not a rival, but a young woman on the verge of being consumed by the same fire that had burned her for so long. "You don't," Camilla said, her voice low and raw. "You don't compete with me. You can't. Because I am not his future. I am his past. A very long, very complicated, very public past." She paused, her eyes glistening. "I was his secret, his shadow, his sin. I was the woman he loved in the dark. You are the woman he chooses in the light. That is your power. And it is your greatest burden." She turned to Charles, who was sitting utterly still, a man caught between two tides. "And you," she said, her voice gaining a sharper edge. "You cannot hold her hand in desperation and expect her to feel secure. You cannot cling to her as if she is a life raft to save you from the consequences of your own life. You have to choose, Charles. Not between her and me. That choice was made long ago, in a church, before God and country. You have to choose to be present, to be fully hers, to stop looking over your shoulder." Charles's face was ashen. "Camilla, that's not fair. You know my feelings for you are different now, transformed." "Exactly," she said, the single word a hammer blow. "Transformed, not erased. But they cannot be the foundation of your life with her. They have to be the echo, not the voice. You cannot grip Kate's hand in quiet desperation, begging her to save you from the mess we made. You have to hold it with conviction, with certainty, leading her forward, not dragging her backward." Kate watched this exchange, her heart pounding. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had. Camilla was not fighting for Charles. She was fighting for his future, for his chance at happiness, even if it meant the final, painful sundering of her own intimate connection with him. She was, in her own way, handing him over. That the release of the hand in the townhouse was nothing compared to this. This was the release of a soul. In the raw aftermath of the library confrontation, a profound shift began to occur. The accusations, the tears, and the brutal honesty had acted like a cleansing storm, washing away the layers of pretense and polite fiction. The dynamic between the three of them would never be the same, but for the first time, it had the potential to be healthy. For Charles, Camilla's words were a mirror held up to his own failings. He saw with devastating clarity the truth in her accusation. He had been clinging to Kate, seeking solace from the torment of his divided loyalties. He had wanted her to be his port in the storm without ever fully dismantling the old, wrecked lighthouse that still stood on the shore. The desperation in his grip that first morning was not just love for Kate. It was fear of letting go of the past. He began a difficult internal journey, and he stopped seeking Camilla's counsel on matters of the heart. Their conversations, when they happened, became more formal, focused on family or estate business. It was a painful amputation, severing the last threads of their intimate emotional dependency. He started, for the first time, to truly see Kate, not as a balm for his old wounds, but as a whole, complex, and brilliant woman in her own right. He began to listen to her opinions, to value her perspective, and to build a partnership based on the present, not the past. Kate, in turn, felt the shift. The desperate, clinging energy from Charles was gone. In its place was a steadier, more confident affection. He began to include her in decisions, to champion her ideas publicly, to present a united front. He stopped flinching when someone mentioned Camilla's name in her presence. He started building their history, one shared moment at a time. He showed her the hidden passages in the palaces. He told her stories of his lonely childhood and shared his hopes for the future of the monarchy. He was letting her in, not as a visitor, but as a co-author of the next chapter of his life. Meanwhile, Camilla began the long, slow process of redefining herself. She was no longer a mistress, no longer a secret. She was a divorcee, a mother, and a woman with decades of unique and painful experience. She threw herself into her own passions, her garden, her charities, her loyal circle of friends. As she stopped orbiting Charles's world and started building her own, separate and distinct. It was a quiet act of self-preservation, but also a final, liberating gift to him. By stepping back, she gave him the space to step forward with Kate. The public, ever watchful, began to sense the change. The tabloid headlines, once filled with speculation of a war of the wives, softened. Photographs emerged of Kate and Camilla walking together in the grounds of Highgrove, and their body language no longer stiff and antagonistic, but cautiously amicable. They were seen sharing a quiet word at a polo match, their heads bent together, two women with the most unique and challenging shared experience imaginable. They were learning a new language, one of mutual, if wary, respect. This new, fragile equilibrium was tested in the most public of arenas. A state banquet at Buckingham Palace. The room was a breathtaking spectacle of glittering chandeliers, gold leaf, and an immaculate white tie attire. Dignitaries and foreign royalty filled the long tables, a sea of medals and tiaras. Charles, as Prince of Wales, sat at the high table, with Kate, radiant in a white gown, and the Cambridge lover's knot tiara by his side. Camilla was also in attendance, seated further down the table, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of her enduring, if redefined, place within the royal fold. Throughout the evening, Charles's behavior was under a microscope, though he seemed unaware of the scrutiny. He was attentive to Kate, leaning in to whisper explanations of the protocols or jokes about the foreign guests. His hand, when it rested on the back of her chair, was relaxed, a gesture of quiet possession, not desperate need. Then came the moment. A visiting dignitary, unaware of the complex history, and made a toast that clumsily referenced the prince's long-standing personal happiness, his eyes sweeping the room in a way that could have included either woman. A hush fell over the nearby tables. Kate's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Charles felt her slight stiffening beside him. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned to her. Under the cover of the tablecloth, hidden from the flashing cameras and prying eyes, he reached for her hand. But this time it was different. Then his grip was not one of quiet desperation. It was firm, warm, and reassuring. It was a silent, powerful message. I am here. You are here. We are us. He held her hand, not as a drowning man clutches a lifeline, but as a partner anchors his partner, offering strength and solidarity. And then he did something that sealed the transformation. He lifted their clasped hands and placed them gently on the white tablecloth, in plain view of the entire room. It was a subtle but utterly deliberate act. You see, it was a public declaration, a statement that needed no words. He was choosing her, openly, proudly, and without reservation. Across the room, Camilla saw the gesture. A flicker of an old pain crossed her features, a ghost of a bygone era. But it was quickly replaced by something else. A slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, a final, silent release. She looked away, a small, sad smile touching her lips, and raised her glass to her own lips. A private toast to a chapter finally, irrevocably closed. The hand that had once been gripped in desperate secrecy was now held in confident public light. The grip of desperation was gone. In its place was the clasp of a future. The years moved on, as they inevitably do, softening sharp edges and weaving disparate threads into a single, rich tapestry. The story of that rainy morning in the London townhouse, of the desperate grip and the command to release it, became a part of family lore, a foundational myth of a new era, and it was rarely spoken of, but its lessons were woven into the very fabric of the lives it had shaped. Charles and Kate's marriage blossomed into one of the most remarkable partnerships the modern monarchy had ever seen. The hesitant, desperate man who had once clung to her hand was replaced by a king who stood tall and confident, his strength visibly bolstered by the woman beside him. Kate, the woman who had once felt like an interloper in her own love story, grew into her role with a grace and dignity that captivated the world. She was not a replacement or a consolation prize. She was a force in her own right, a modern queen for a new age. Their love, forged in the crucible of public scrutiny and private pain, was a testament to resilience and the courage to build something new on ground that had once seemed impossibly fractured. And Camilla? She found her own peace. She became a beloved grandmother, a fixture at country pursuits, and a quiet source of wisdom within the family. The years transformed her public image from the most hated woman in Britain to a respected elder, her past transgressions softened by time and her own quiet dignity. She had her own home, her own life, her own place. She was no longer defined by her relationship to the king, but by her own steady presence. One crisp autumn afternoon years later, Kate was walking through the gardens of Clarence House. The leaves were turning, and a riot of gold and amber. She saw Camilla sitting on a bench, a book open on her lap, a blanket over her knees. On impulse, Kate walked over and sat down beside her. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the way old friends can. "It's a beautiful day," Kate said softly. "It is," Camilla agreed, closing her book. She looked at Kate, her gaze warm and clear. "You know, I watched you at the reception last night. You were magnificent. He is so lucky." Kate smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Hey, we are lucky. All of us in our own way. It took a long time to get here." Camilla nodded, her eyes drifting to the horizon. "It did. It took a lot of pain, a lot of honesty, and a lot of letting go." Kate reached over and, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable in those early, tortured days, gently placed her hand over Camilla's. It was a brief, light touch, but it was electric with meaning. It was an acknowledgement of the journey, a thank you for the release. A recognition that they were bound together, not by rivalry, but by their shared love for the same complicated man, and by the family they had all, in their own way, helped to build. Camilla looked down at Kate's hand on hers, then up into the younger woman's eyes. A lifetime of emotion passed between them in that single look: regret, forgiveness, pride, and a deep, abiding peace. She gave a small nod, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sadness, but of a profound and final release. The grip of desperation was a distant memory. What remained was the gentle, enduring clasp of a hard-won and deeply human peace.